Howdy howdy, Suit over here. We're going to continue our Dwarf faction focus for online battles. I'm going to call the series Essential Units. In the first video we looked at the combination of a Thunder, Trollhammer torpedoes, Quarrelers, and an Engineer versus the enemy Lord. And the Thunders came out on top by a mile, being a very, very cost-effective unit to get the job done. At the very least, you're never going to go wrong including one unit of Thunders in your army. Now, one of the reasons a lot of people don't want to choose Thunders because they often lose line of sight when they're in the battle. They can't shoot over your own units. And I think that with good play you can avoid that problem. And a lot of times you will get a lot of open shots on flying units or flanking units and stuff like that. But I included this little video to show a way to kind of get around that. And I've also included links to other YouTubers. This technique in specific comes from a YouTuber that goes by Party Elite. I linked his video on the kill box. And you can see right here, I'm just opening up a line for my Thunders to shoot at. Now, in an actual online battle, a human player is going to notice that at some point, but you're for sure going to get off at least one round, maybe two. And the beauty is, if they do charge your Quarrelers, or your Thunders rather, it's not the end of the world. Your Thunders are pretty robust. They're going to be able to take that charge just fine, and the unit they were fighting is going to get to charge them in the back. And if you have units in reserve, you're going to be able to make it a 2-on-1 or a 3-on-1 and route that unit very quickly. So it's a very effective way to get your Thunders into the game. Now I'm going to call this series Essential Units because I think these units are the very best, the most cost-effective units in the Dwarf roster. Now that doesn't mean you have to use them. Of course, there are a lot of different ways to win a battle, and I've included some other YouTubers out there, like Turin, for example, who has his own playstyle and definitely doesn't use all the units that I'm going to suggest. But that doesn't mean you have to. You can find units that are that suit your playstyle. What I really want to provide is some really good analysis so that you have good information when you're going to build your own army to optimize your army in terms of the units that are going to perform the best and the play style that's going to suit you. So if you don't have any ranged units in your army, Thunders aren't going to be for you. If you tend to have all three Quarrelers, consider taking one unit of Thunders and see if you can't squeeze out a little bit more by targeting those Thunders on the enemy Lords or using them in different ways. What I really want to do is give some good information to people that are building their armies to help them make them just a little bit better. Some of the other channels that I want to point your attention to watch some really great online battles and to get some great ideas for different army setups are Mr. Smart Donkey, Prince of Mastodon, who's been a Total War YouTuber forever and a day, Zerkovich, Heir of Carthage, and the Strategy Professor, who's a fairly new YouTuber but gives a much deeper analysis of his armies, and his Let's Plays are also very detailed, which I think contain a lot of great information. So without further ado, we're going to get on to our next Dwarven set of units to test. Now the next unit on the list is the Dwarf Gyrocopter. It is the most unique unit in the game. It can fight air to air, air to ground, it has bombs, they're very fast, they're armored, and they give the Dwarf army something they badly need, which is mobility. The question we need to answer is, are they worth getting? And if so, which ones will be the most effective in your army? The first set of tests I did with the Gyrocopters is I really wanted to see how much damage they were capable of. How much damage their bombs do. Are they different from Gyro Bomber to Gyrocopter to Brimstone Gun? And how much damage are their guns capable of? So I set up two tests, one against a lightly armored foe and one against a heavily armored foe, so I could do my free bombing runs and expend all my ammo and find out how much damage was each unit capable of. Here's a first set of data that I got looking at the Gyrocopter, the Brimstone Gun, and the Bomber. And the first run against the Savage Orcs, it looks like the Gyrocopter and the Brimstone Gun basically have the same exact bombs. They did 49 and 48 kills respectively, and the Gyro Bomber is fairly disappointing for its additional cost. Even though it has more bombs, there's only one of those in a unit, and it only did 92 kills. Now, when we went to guns, the normal Gyrocopter did fairly well, 195 kills, but the Brimstone gun was pretty competitive at 166, and the Bomber was just not even in the game. So if we look at the total kills they did to the Savage Orcs, really their highest potential, and this is without melee because they can go down in melee attack as well, is 244 for the Gyrocopter, 214 for the Brimstone gun, and 126 for the Bomber. So the Bomber seems pretty weak, all things considered. Now, I went against some Black Orcs, and I just took the total of the bombs and guns to find out how much damage they can do. Now, the regular Gyrocopter was only able to kill 56, whereas a Brimstone gun did much better at 73, and the Bomber did a little better at 83, but not a whole lot when you consider that differential in cost. So when we look at just the max amount of damage these units can do, the Gyrocopter and the Brimstone guns are relatively competitive for their cost of 700 and 800 respectively, but the Bomber really doesn't seem like a unit that's going to be very useful on the battlefield. Now, I wanted to put the Gyrocopters through their paces to see what they were capable of coming up against units that could affect them, like artillery can shoot them down, archers, these types of things. And this is kind of one of the great things about the Gyrocopters. If you're going up against an army with a lot of artillery and no way to do anything about your flying unit, you can really wreak havoc. And although it takes a ton of micro, and that's the one caveat to the Gyrocopters in general, is they require a lot of micro to be really effective, they can do a lot. And in the first test here, I just wanted to see, could I use one unit with full micro? I'm only focusing on this unit, of course, and take out 4 artillery units. And really, I had to move them around a lot, but it really wasn't that difficult. Expended the bombs, which is one thing I think you need to do relatively early before any gets shot down, unless you really have no competition in the sky. But when it comes to anti-artillery and setting up your battlefield, you can pull your units a little further back so their artillery have to move forward to be in range, send your Gyrocopters out, and really wreak havoc. And it's one of the beautiful things. If your Gyrocopters are in there hitting their artillery, the rest of their army has to do something. And that is one of the things that in any battle, you really forcing your opponent to make moves when they're not ready to is one of the key components. And that's one of the big advantages Gyrocopters have. Now, in this here test, it really wasn't very difficult because I was microing the whole time. It's going to be a lot harder in the midst of a battle to do something like this, but these guys can really do some work on enemy artillery. The next test I wanted to do was just to see how fast I could rout a unit of archers. And this is, again, one of the other keys for your Gyrocopters is how quickly can they have an impact on the battlefield. Now, in this test, they weren't shooting back. I just wanted to see if I dropped my bombs and got things going, how quickly could I get this done. And really, these Gyrocopters can do some work. If you look at the archers, they're already ready to rout, one shot in and they're gone. And that fast, you basically turn them around. Now, if you wanted, you could chase them down and make sure they kept routing, but in a matter of 30 seconds, they took out an enemy unit and got them moving the other way. Now, when you look at online battles, sometimes there's 2 to 4 enemy archers and that kind of thing, but just looking at one, that really shows the potential of the Gyrocopter, and I think it can be incredibly effective at getting the job done there. So far, things are looking pretty great, but one of the flaws the gyrocopters have, and you'll see in this encounter, is that they really take a lot. They don't take a lot of damage, but when they get hit, they move, and it puts them out of their firing sequence. And this is really, I think, almost fatal in some ways. Is you can't really stand up in a one-on-one fight with pretty much any unit. You have to release your bombs, and if you don't, your gyrocopters are not going to be that effective, because every time they get hit, they get knocked into a stagger sequence, and it puts them off their game. And this is one thing that, if you're going to use gyrocopters, you definitely have to be aware of. Alternatively, here we're going to take a look at where your gyrocopters really excel. And here we got some brimstone guns against demigryph knights. Now, demigryph knights with halberds or pretty much anything are just devastating, and they're one of the units that I despise the most. And this is where your gyrocopters can really make a difference in the battle. They can drop their bombs and just start shooting, and the brimstone guns will do some work because the demigryph knights are considered large, and they're anti-large, so they're much faster than the demigryph knights, so they can chase them down, they can harass them, they can really make your opponent throw them into combat way earlier than they intended to, because if you have your gyrocopters on them and they have no way of competing in the air, then you really can set the tone of that encounter. And this is one of the areas where the gyrocopters really excel, especially the gyrocopters with brimstone guns. They're just fantastic for this type of thing. And here we go back to a counter example of where the gyrocopters are weak. The weakest flying unit in the game are bats, and I just put them into combat with these, one gyrocopter versus two bats. So we definitely have a technically an advantage on cost, yet the gyrocopters just can't get it done, even against a fairly weak unit when they get into, I don't want to say melee combat, but not ranged combat. They're really quite ineffective, and these fellbats here do a number on them and end up routing them. And that's one of the things that anyone who's using gyrocopters really needs to understand, that any other air-to-air unit is going to dominate your gyrocopters. But that said, your gyrocopters are extremely fast. They're as fast as anything else in the air. And one of the things you can use your gyrocopters for are to kite other air units away, or kite them into your ranged units in the back of your line. So understand that if it comes to an air-to-air combat where you're going to be in quote-unquote melee, the gyrocopter is not going to get the job done. You have to keep them out of that situation if you want to keep them active. So I think understanding that even against the weakest air unit in the game, the gyrocopters are not going to do really good, is good information when it comes to choosing your units and really making your battle plan. In this last example here, we see where the gyrocopter really falls short as compared to the brimstone gun, and that's against enemy lords, and the gyrocopter literally does absolutely nothing. It does have a shorter range than the brimstone gun, which makes it a little worse as well, but when it's attacking the enemy lord, you might as well be throwing pebbles at it. It really can't get the job done. So when we're looking at the choices of the gyrocopters, I think the base gyrocopter and the gyro bomber are just not going to cut it. So when it comes to making your decision on what unit you want, I think the brimstone gun is the only unit that's going to be able to use to good effect. And that's really important when you pick your army. You can really narrow that choice down and only pick the units that's going to do the job for you. The last question to answer is, if you're going to put brimstone guns in your army, how many should you choose? And I think the answer has to be 2, and that's because when you're using them, the advantage of having 2 is, if you're like in this battle coming up against only one flying unit, you can separate your gyrocopters or your brimstone guns and kite him with one and go to work with the other. I can't see having more than two being a good choice, and two is risky depending on the faction you're going to go against, but we'll take a look at that as we break everything down here. So I thought it might be best to take a look at the Gyrocopter with brimstone guns, as that is the only unit we're considering in terms of its pros and cons. The first con we have to consider is that it is going to be weak against all other flying units in melee. This is something that you really have to pay attention to if you're going to put them into your army. The Gyrocopter with brimstone guns is also going to be weak in a straight up shootout against all other ranged units, especially if they have armor piercing. So if you're going up against ranged units, you have to get in there and drop your bombs if you want to make that a positive outcome. The brimstone gun has relatively low HP hit points for the 800 goal layout, and that does mean they're prone to routing, and if you're not really watching their health, you're going to watch them fly off the edge of the map. Lastly, they have relatively low DPS with the exception of their bomb burst, so you can't expect them to really take something down fast. You have to think of your brimstone guns as something that's just going to chip away at the health or affect the leadership of an opposing unit and trying to get them to rout. They really aren't going to tear something up, even if it's a 2-on-1. Now, of course, there are going to be other cons, but when you do this type of analysis, no matter how hard you try, you tend to be biased. So if you guys can think of anything else that's a real con to the Gyrocopter with brimstone guns, please leave a comment down below. I would definitely appreciate it. Now we're going to have a look at the pros. And the first big pro is that the Gyrocopters can chase routing units off the battlefield. And especially for the Dwarf army, this is very important because all your other units are terribly slow, with the exception of the Slayers, but you really generally don't want to have Slayers chasing units off the battlefield. You want to get them in there and kill things, but Gyrocopters can get this job done very effectively. The next big pro is that you can kite stronger flying units around the map or into your backline ranged units, and this is no small thing. Being able to kite a 1400 or 2000 gold unit with an 800 gold unit around the map is very beneficial, and bringing them back into your backline can really be costly to the enemy army. This next one is a big one, and it is that the Gyrocopters can just be annoying, and I've heard other YouTubers describe them as annoying to play against, and this is no small thing. Being able to take your opponent off his or her game is really, really important, and giving them something else to think about, something else to micro, something else to do while they're trying to engage their main army can really have an effect on how well they do and their own attention and their own micro. So being annoying is no small thing. The Gyrocopter is very fast. It's faster than any cav, can chase them all down. The only air unit I think that's faster would be the Fellbats, but that gives you a lot of mobility on the battlefield, a lot of options, and it makes your army much more flexible. The Brimstone gun does have that anti-large trait, and it does fire an explosive damage which can hurt regenerating units. And it also has armor piercing, which is fantastic. And remember, even against lightly armored units, it does compare in total damage to the regular Gyrocopter. So it's an all-around good, it has an all-around good set of weaponry for getting the job done pretty much anywhere. And when things hit the fan, one of the nice things about the Gyrocopter is it can catch your opponent sleeping. And what I mean by that is it doesn't do a massive amount of DPS, but it just picks away, and before you know it, you've brought something down to half health, and then it becomes too late for your opponent to react. So that's a really fantastic trait. The last, and I think the most important trait to the Gyrocopter with Brimstone guns is that it forces your opponent into action. And this is something the Dwarf army really doesn't have. I mean, you can have a lot of artillery and see if you can get them to come to you that way, but nothing is quite as effective as forcing moves by your opponent as the Gyrocopter, because it makes them take action. They can't let your Gyrocopters just chip away. They have to do something about it. And that's a really key component, because there is no other unit in the Dwarf army that can accomplish that task. Again, if there's any pros that I've missed, please feel free to leave a comment below. I would greatly appreciate it. To put things into perspective, I don't think you'd ever imagine an optimum Empire army with no cavalry. And Gyrocopters are the same to the Dwarfs. I think they are an essential unit. Now, 1 is never going to be enough, and more than 2 is going to be too much. I think 2 is the right number, because they do have their drawbacks. And against some armies, like the Bretonnians with their Pegasus Knights, can be very punishing. You really aren't going to get to use your Gyrocopters how you want. But all in all, this unit, I think, is very, very effective when it's used for its correct role. Now, as I said in the beginning, all armies can be different, and there's different ways to win, and of course you don't have to have these in your army to be successful, but I definitely encourage you to give them a go if you've never tried them before. It's a challenge to use them effectively, but they can be very, very rewarding and very, very effective on the battlefield, and I think it is one of those great unique unit for the Dwarf armies that can make your army better. Anyways, that's all I have for now. I hope you found the information interesting and useful, and I'll see you next time.